Nobody in Comfort County believed a chicken could outlast a locust, and fewer still believed a widow could outlast either one. But on the morning the freight wagon rattled up the Marsh Place road hauling 1,000 sick, wet, half-dead chicks in slatted crates, both of those things were about to be tested at once. Adeline Marsh stood at the fence with her arms crossed and her jaw set, the way it had been set every day since her husband's funeral 18 months before. And she watched the driver haul the crates down one by one, and she counted them without moving her lips. And when the last crate hit the dirt, she reached into her apron pocket and paid the man every coin she had left to her name. He looked at the crates, and he looked at her, and he said, "Ma'am, half these birds won't see Thursday." She said, "Then I'll bury half and raise the other half, and either way, it's mine to decide." He shrugged the way men shrug when they've decided a woman's ruin is none of their business, climbed back onto his wagon board, and left her standing alone in a yard full of dying chickens under a sky the color of old tin. That was the beginning, though nobody watching would have called it that. They would have called it foolishness, and for a while they did. The Marsh Ranch sat at the low end of the valley, where the creek used to run before the dry years took it down to a trickle. And it had been a fine spread once, back when Adeline's husband Thomas was alive, and the cattle numbered in the hundreds instead of the dozen scrawny head that remained. Thomas had died of a fever the doctor never did name, quick and mean, the kind of death that leaves no time for goodbyes and no answers for the woman left behind. And after the burying, most of the county expected Adeline to sell the land to whoever offered first and go back east to family. She did not sell. She did not go east. She stayed, and she worked the ranch alone with a stubbornness that people mistook for grief, when in truth it was something closer to defiance. She was 26 years old, and she had her mother's ledger book, her father's rifle that she kept but rarely fired, and a memory, buried deep enough that even she had half forgotten it, of her grandmother telling her something about chickens and grasshoppers that she hadn't understood as a girl and hadn't thought of in 15 years. Not until the week before, when old Ezra Bell said something at the feed store that snagged in her mind like a burr in wool. Ezra Bell had lived in Comfort County longer than anyone could account for. He ran the feed store with the patience of a man who had outlived most of his opinions, and he was known for saying little and meaning most of it. Adeline had gone in for cornmeal and come out with a warning instead. "Locusts are coming back," he'd said, not looking up from the sack he was weighing. "Same cycle as 61. Every 7 years, near enough. You watch the horizon come August. You'll see." She'd asked him how he knew, and he'd said, "Because I watched my daddy lose 2 seasons to it, and I watched the folks who prepared keep their land, and I watched the folks who didn't lose everything they had." Then he'd said the thing that stuck. "Only thing that ever ate a hopper plague down to nothing before it started was fowl. More fowl than sense, and someone willing to raise them mean and hungry." She had not planned, that day, to buy 1,000 sick chicks. She had planned to buy feed and go home. But that night, alone at her kitchen table with a lamp burning low and the ledger open in front of her, showing numbers that told her the ranch had maybe one more bad year left in it before the bank came calling, she remembered her grandmother's voice from a summer porch long gone, saying that chickens would eat a locust swarm bare if you had enough of them and got them out early enough. And that the trick nobody wanted to hear was that the cheap chicks, the culled ones, the sick ones nobody wanted, could be nursed back if a person had the patience for it. And that patience was the one thing poor folks always had more of than money. So when the traveling hatchery agent came through 3 days later, selling off his cull stock cheap because a fever had run through his brooding house and left 1,000 chicks weak and unwanted, bound for the stew pot or the burn pile, Adeline did not think of it as foolishness. She thought of it as the only hand she had left to play. The town thought otherwise. Word moved through Comfort County the way it always did, mouth to mouth to mouth, gathering shape and color as it went, until by the time it reached the mercantile counter, it had become that the widow Marsh had lost her senses entirely and spent her last money on a wagon load of dying birds. Otis Pruitt heard it there, standing by the counter buying rope, and he laughed loud enough that 3 other men laughed with him before they even knew what they were laughing at. Otis ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, and he had, more than once, offered to buy the marsh land at a price that would have insulted a stranger, let alone a widow who knew exactly what her husband's acres were worth. Each time she'd refused him, and each time his offer had come back a little lower, as if her hardship were a tide he expected to keep receding until she washed up on his doorstep begging to sign. He was not a cruel man, not by his own accounting. He believed himself reasonable, even generous, a man simply waiting for inevitability to do his negotiating for him. "She'll come around," he told the men at the counter. "Woman can't run cattle and can't run crops, and now she can't even pick a healthy chicken. Give it till spring." Nobody in the store corrected him, because nobody in the store believed she could prove him wrong either. Adeline did not hear the laughter that day, but she felt its shape in the way people looked at her afterward, the way conversations went quiet when she entered a room, the way old Mrs. Calloway at church patted her hand and said, "Bless your heart, dear," in the particular tone that meant something else entirely. She kept her chin level and her mouth shut, because she had learned in 18 months of widowhood that explaining herself to people who had already made up their minds was a waste of breath better spent on work. And there was work. God knew there was work. She converted the old horse barn into a brooding house, stuffing every seam and gap with rags against the wind, and she built low pens out of scrap lumber and chicken wire that she strung herself with hands that blistered and healed and blistered again. She kept lanterns burning through the cold nights to hold the temperature, refilling the oil at 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, and again before dawn, sleeping in short, broken stretches on a cot she dragged into the barn so she wouldn't have to cross the yard in the freezing dark. She mixed cornmeal with warm water and a little vinegar, the way her grandmother's voice, resurrected now in memory with startling clarity, told her would settle their stomachs. She lost birds. She lost more birds than she wanted to count. Small, stiff bodies she buried at the tree line in the gray hour before sunrise, so she would not have to look at them all day. And each time she buried one, she felt the weight of Otis Pruitt's prediction settle a little heavier on her shoulders. But she did not stop. By the 3rd week, something had shifted. The chicks that had survived were not merely surviving now, they were thriving, fattening on scratch grain and bugs she gathered from the dead grass at the field's edge, growing feathers in dense, ragged coats, following her across the yard in a yellow and brown river when she walked out each morning with the feed bucket. She had lost near 400 of the original 1,000. 600 remained, and they were, against every expectation the county had voiced aloud, healthy. It was Del Whitfield who first said something kind about it, and Del was not in the habit of saying much at all. Del had drifted into the valley the autumn before, a lean, quiet young man of 22, with calloused hands and a way of watching people work before he offered his opinion on how they ought to do it. He'd taken odd jobs around Comfort County, mending fences here, breaking horses there, sleeping in whoever's barn would have him, and when he'd shown up at the Marsh place asking if she needed help in exchange for a bed and a meal, Adeline had almost turned him away out of the same caution every unmarried woman alone learns to carry. But there was something in the careful way he'd asked, hat in his hands, eyes down, that made her decide to risk it. And she had never regretted the decision, not once, not even on the mornings he was too quiet to be good company. "They're bigger than mine were at this age," Del said one morning, crouched at the pen fence, watching the flock scatter and regroup around a handful of scratch. "And mine never had fever to fight through first." "Might be they're stubborn," Adeline said. "Might be they take after who's raising them," Del said, and then looked immediately embarrassed at having said something that sounded like a compliment, and went back to mending the fence wire without another word. Adeline found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could easily place, and she did not examine that feeling too closely. Not yet. The summer wore on, the way summers in Comfort County always did, dry and long and full of the particular waiting that ranch life demanded, the waiting for rain that mostly did not come, the waiting for calves and crops and chicks to grow into something worth the effort poured into them. Adeline's flock grew from 600 sickly survivors into 600 solid, feathered, restless birds that ranged the dead grass around the barn in search of every beetle and hopper and grasshopper they could find. And Adeline began to notice, with a small private satisfaction she did not share with anyone but Del, that the grass near the coop stayed remarkably free of the early season insects that plagued the rest of the valley's fields. She thought often of Ezra Bell's warning, and in the evenings, after the chores were done and the lanterns lit, she took to walking the 2 miles into town to sit with him at the feed store's back porch, where he'd tell her what he remembered of 61, piece by piece, the way the sky had gone dark at midday, the way the sound had come first, a low, buzzing hum that grew and grew until a man couldn't hear his own thoughts, the way the swarm had stripped whole fields bare in under an hour, leaves and stalks and bark all gone, nothing left standing but dirt. "How'd anyone survive it?" she asked him one evening, the two of them watching the sun go down orange and heavy over the western ridge. "Those who had birds did better than those who didn't," Ezra said. "Chickens, turkeys, guinea fowl, didn't matter much which, so long as there were enough of them and they were let loose early, before the swarm settled and started laying its own eggs in the ground for next year's trouble. Folks who had nothing but crops and prayer, they lost it all. Folks who had fowl, they lost some, but they kept their land because the birds ate the hoppers down before they could finish what they came to do." He paused, working a piece of straw between his teeth. Course, that was 30 years back, near enough. Most folks around here weren't grown yet, or weren't here at all. I doubt there's a soul under 50 in this county remembers it clear enough to believe it's coming again. I believe you, Adeline said. Ezra looked at her sideways, the closest thing to surprise his weathered face ever showed. Most don't, he said. Most think an old man talking about grasshoppers is an old man talking to hear himself talk. I bought 1,000 sick chicks on the strength of what you said in a feed store, Adeline said. I believe you. He was quiet a long moment, and then he said, Well, then you'd best be ready by August, because if the pattern holds, that's when they'll come, and they won't send word first. She left the feed store that evening with a knot of something new sitting in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite purpose, but some cousin of both. And she did not sleep well that night, and she did not sleep well many nights after, because now the waiting had a shape to it, a deadline pressing down from somewhere out past the horizon that nobody else in Comfort County could see coming. That same week, on a Sunday evening when the chores were finally done and the light had gone soft and gold over the western ridge, Adeline walked out to the tree line where Thomas was buried, the way she did most Sundays, not out of habit alone, but because it was the 1 hour of the week she allowed herself to stop moving long enough to feel the weight of everything she carried. She sat in the grass beside the marker, plain wood, his name carved simple and small, and she told him about the chickens the way she told him most things now, quietly, without expecting an answer, because the telling itself was the point. Everyone thinks I've lost my mind, she said. Maybe I have. But your mother used to say a person's got to bet on something, and I'd rather bet on birds and an old man's memory than sit here waiting for the bank to come collect what's left of us. The wind moved through the dry grass, and somewhere behind her, faint across the yard, she could hear the low, contented murmur of the flock settling for the evening, and she found something like peace in that sound, small and imperfect as it was. Dell found her there as she was walking back, not by accident, she suspected, though he never said so. He fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked the rest of the way to the house together in the particular silence that had grown comfortable between them over the months, the kind of silence that asked nothing and required nothing. At the porch steps, he finally spoke. My mother's buried outside Abilene, he said. Haven't seen the grave in 6 years. Don't figure I ever will again. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about the weather, and Adeline understood, without either of them needing to say it further, that he had told her something true about himself in exchange for what he'd witnessed her doing at the tree line, and that this was, in its own quiet way, a kind of trust being built one small honesty at a time. You're welcome to visit her grave, Adeline said. I mean, if you had one nearby. I know it's not the same. It isn't, Dell agreed, but it's something. He did not say more than that, and neither did she, and they went in to supper, and the matter was never raised again, but Adeline found herself thinking of it often in the weeks that followed, the way small shared griefs sometimes did more to knit two people together than any grand gesture could have managed. The work did not slow for grief or reflection, and by the second week of August, the flock had grown restless in a way Adeline could not name at first. Birds pacing the pen fences in the mornings, unusually alert, feathers ruffled against a wind that carried something on it none of the humans in the valley could smell or hear yet. She mentioned it to Ezra on her next visit to the feed store, and he nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Animals know before we do," he said. "Always have. My daddy used to say the birds start acting strange a week, 10 days out, if you're paying attention. Most folks aren't paying attention. You are, so you'll have your warning when the rest of the valley's still asleep to it." He handed her an extra sack of scratch grain that day and refused payment for it, the first and only time in all her visits that he did so. And when she tried to press coins into his hand anyway, he waved her off with the same economical gesture he used for most things. "Call it an old man's contribution," he said. "I couldn't stop it 30 years back. Maybe I can help stop it this time, even if all I've got left to give is grain and memory." August arrived hot and still, the kind of stillness that sits over a valley like a held breath. And Adeline spent the first 2 weeks of it doing what she could to ready the flock, moving pens closer to the wheat fields at the county's edge, the ones that belonged to families who could least afford to lose a harvest, though she had not yet told any of those families why she was doing it, because she knew exactly how that conversation would go. She had tried once, cautiously, mentioning to Mrs. Calloway after church that she thought it might be wise for folks to consider raising fowl against a bad hopper year, and Mrs. Calloway had smiled, the patient smile of someone humoring a woman not quite right in the head, and said, "That's very industrious of you, dear," and changed the subject to the church social. Otis Pruitt, when word reached him that the widow Marsh was moving her chicken pens out toward the wheat fields, found it the funniest thing he'd heard all season. He rode out to the Marsh place himself, uninvited, sat his horse at the fence line, and called out to her while she worked. "Heard you're fixin' to march your chickens into battle, Mrs. Marsh," he said, grinning down at her. "What exactly are they fighting?" Adeline straightened up from the pen she was repairing, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him steadily. "Grasshoppers, Mr. Pruitt," she said. "Same as ate this valley bare 30 years back, and same as is due to come back any week now, if Ezra Bell's memory serves, which it generally does." Otis laughed, an easy, dismissive sound. "Ezra Bell's memory serves him a story to tell at the feed store, so folks will stay and buy more than they came for. There's no plague coming, Mrs. Marsh. There's just a woman who spent her last coin on sick birds and needs a reason it wasn't wasted money." "You're welcome to believe that," Adeline said, and turned back to her fence. "I mean you no unkindness," Otis said, his tone shifting towards something almost gentle, which was, in its way, worse than his mockery. "I've made you a fair offer for this land 3 times over. I'll make it a 4th. Take it before winter, before you've spent every last thing you have on chicken feed and pride, and go somewhere you won't have to work yourself into the ground alone." "This is my land, Mr. Pruitt," Adeline said, without turning around. "It was my husband's, and it's mine, and I intend to keep it, and I'd thank you to let me finish my fence before dark." He sat his horse a moment longer, watching her back, and then he turned and rode away, and Adeline did not let herself sit down until he was well out of sight, because she had learned that some kinds of strength only held up as long as nobody was watching them nearly break. The swarm came on the 23rd of August in the late morning, And the first sign of it was the sound Ezra had described, a low hum on the eastern wind that Adeline heard from the yard and mistook for one long breath for distant thunder. Then Dell came running from the fence line where he'd been mending a gate, hat gone, shouting her name, and she looked east and saw the sky itself had changed color. A dark, moving smear low against the blue, spreading and thickening as it came, and she understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after months of dread, that Ezra Bell had been exactly right. "Get the pens open," she said to Dell, her voice steadier than she felt. "All of them, every pen. Let them loose toward the wheat fields, now, before the swarm settles." They ran together, pen to pen, throwing gates wide, and 600 birds poured out into the fields in a rushing yellow-brown tide, scattering wide across the wheat and the dead grass and the fence lines beyond. And Adeline stood at the edge of it all with her heart hammering and watched the black cloud on the horizon grow closer. Close enough now that she could see it was not smoke or storm, but a churning, living mass, wings catching the sun in sudden flickers of light. The first hoppers landed at the field's edge within minutes, and Adeline watched her birds turn toward them the way a starving man turns toward bread. And the sound that rose up from the fields was unlike anything she had heard before. A frantic, churning clatter of wings and beaks and scrabbling feet. 600 chickens moving through the wheat like a living harrow. And for one terrible stretch of minutes, it seemed impossible that so few birds could do anything against so vast a swarm. The sky still dark with incoming insects, even as the birds worked the ground below. Word spread through the valley faster than the swarm itself. Riders going farm to farm, shouting the warning, and families came running from every direction with sacks and brooms and whatever noise-making tools they could grab, beating pots and shouting to try to drive the hoppers back. And it was chaos. Real chaos. The kind that swallows a community whole in the space of an afternoon. But in the fields nearest the marsh place, where 600 well-fed, well-raised birds had been loosed early enough to meet the swarm at its edge instead of its center, something different was happening. The chickens were not merely surviving the plague. They were eating it. By late afternoon, when the main body of the swarm had finally passed on westward, leaving stripped fields and broken families in its wake across most of the county, the fields nearest Adeline's flock stood battered but not bare, wheat stalks chewed but not devoured whole. Because her birds had thinned the swarm's leading edge before it could fully settle, scattering what remained before it could lay eggs in the soft ground the way Ezra had warned it would. Eggs that would have hatched a second, worse plague the following spring. Adeline walked her fields that evening in the strange orange light of a sunset made stranger still by the dust the swarm had kicked into the air. And she counted her losses. Birds trampled or lost to exhaustion. Wheat chewed low in patches. But when she stood at the fence line and looked at the fields beyond her own, at the Hendersons' place and the Callaways and the small plots belonging to families with no fowl at all, she saw ground stripped down to bare dirt, not a green stalk left standing. And she understood the difference between what she had lost and what everyone else had lost.
and it was not a small difference. It was the difference between a hard winter and no winter to plan for at all. Dell found her there at the fence and stood beside her without speaking for a long while, both of them looking out at the ruined valley in the fading light. "You did that," he said finally.
"Whatever's left standing out there, you did that." "Ezra did that," Adeline said. "I just believed him." "Not many would have," Dell said. "Not many did." She thought of Otis Pruitt's easy laughter at the fence line, and she found, to her own surprise, that she felt no satisfaction in what she knew was coming. No sharp edge of vindication. Only a tired kind of clarity. The kind that comes after a long fight finally settles into something a person can rest inside of. The days that followed brought the whole valley to her door in one form or another. Families first, quiet and humbled, asking what she had done and how she had known to do it. And Adeline told them plainly, no embellishment, that Ezra Bell had remembered the pattern and she had believed him, and that fowl, raised early and loosed at the right hour, could do what no amount of prayer or noise or panic could. She gave away chicks from the surviving flock to any family willing to try it themselves, refusing payment from most of them, because she understood now, in a way she had not fully understood before that August morning, that surviving alone was a hollow kind of surviving if the whole valley around her went under. Otis Pruitt came last of all, 3 days after the swarm passed, riding out to the marsh place at dusk the way he had before, but this time he dismounted before he spoke, and he stood at the fence with his hat in his hands instead of on his head, and Adeline, watching him from the yard, thought that she had never once seen him look uncertain before that moment. "My east pasture's stripped to nothing," he said. "Same with most of my hayfields. I'll be buying feed clear through till spring, and I'll be lucky if I don't lose stock to it before the year's out." He turned his hat in his hands. "Your fields aren't in much better shape than the rest, from what I hear. But your neighbor's wheat is standing when it had no business standing, and every one of them says it's on account of your chickens." "They're not my chickens anymore, mostly," Adeline said. "I gave most of the flock away." "I heard that too," Otis said. He was quiet a moment, and then he said in the voice of a man forcing out words he was not accustomed to using, "I laughed at you in the mercantile. Told half the county you'd lost your senses. I was wrong, Mrs. Marsh, and I've come to say so plainly, and to ask, if you'll have me as a customer instead of a fool, whether you'd sell me chicks come spring, and tell me how you raise them through the sick season, because I mean to do the same on my own land before the next cycle comes round, whether that's 7 years off or 70. Adeline studied him a long moment, this man who had spent 1.5 years trying to buy her grief out from under her, now standing hat in hand, asking for her knowledge instead of her land, and she found that she did not need to make him suffer for the asking. "I'll sell you chicks," she said, "and I'll tell you everything Ezra Bell told me, so you can tell it to your own children some day, and they can tell it to theirs, and maybe next time the whole valley's ready, instead of just the one fool widow everybody laughed at." Otis's mouth twitched at that, something almost like a smile. "Nobody's laughing now, Mrs. Marsh," he said. "No," Adeline agreed. "Nobody's laughing now." In the weeks right after the swarm passed, before the valley had fully found its feet again, Adeline made a point of riding out to see Ezra Bell more often than the feed store business alone required, and she found him one afternoon sitting on his back porch with a look on his face she had not seen there before, something soft and unguarded, watching a pair of her chicks that she had brought him as a gift peck at the dirt near his boots. 30 years I carried that story around, he said, and not one soul in this valley wanted to hear it as anything but an old man's tale. You were the first to believe it might cost you something to be wrong, and you bet on it anyway. Adeline sat down beside him on the porch step, and for a while neither of them said anything else, content to watch the chicks scratch in the dust while the sun dropped low and easy over the ridge. I didn't do it because I was brave, she finally said. I did it because I didn't have anything left to lose by trying. Ezra nodded slowly. That's most bravery, if you look at it close enough, he said. Just folks who ran out of safer choices and did the hard thing anyway. It was a small conversation, unremarkable to anyone who might have overheard it, but Adeline carried it with her long after, the way she carried most of what Ezra told her, turning it over quietly on the evenings when doubt crept back in, despite everything she had already proven to herself and to the valley both. The seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to the dramas played out beneath them, and the valley healed slowly, the way land always does when it is given enough time and enough hands willing to work it. Adeline's flock grew back from what she'd given away, and by the following spring, half the ranches in Comfort County kept fowl of their own. Small flocks at first, then larger ones, until the sight of chickens ranging free along fence lines and field edges became as ordinary a part of the valley's look as the wheat itself. Ezra Bell lived long enough to see it, and he took to telling the story of the widow Marsh and her 1,000 sick chicks with the same patient economy he told every story, though those who knew him well noticed he told that one a little slower than the rest, as if he wanted every word of it to land. Dell stayed on at the Marsh Ranch through that winter and the next, and though neither of them spoke of it plainly for a long while, the quiet, easy rhythm they had built together, mending fences and raising flocks and sitting on the porch in the evenings, saying little and meaning most of it, had become something neither one of them was in any hurry to end. Adeline still kept her mother's ledger, still kept her father's rifle above the door, still visited Thomas's grave at the tree line on quiet mornings when the work allowed for it. But the ranch that had once felt like a burden she was determined to carry alone had become, slowly and without any single dramatic turning point she could name, a place worth staying for reasons beyond stubbornness. Years later, when the 7-year cycle turned again and a new swarm rose dark on the eastern horizon, it was not panic that swept through Comfort County this time, but a kind of practiced calm, pens thrown open all across the valley at the first low hum on the wind, flocks pouring out into the fields the way Adeline's had once done alone. And this time it was a young woman, not much more than a girl grown, standing at the marsh fence line beside Adeline, watching the birds work the swarm's edge with the same steady attention Adeline herself had once learned from a feed store owner and a memory of her grandmother's voice. "You did all this," the young woman said, echoing words spoken once before at that same fence, in that same fading light. Ezra did some of it, Adeline said, the way she always said it. I just believed him. And now you will too. And you'll teach the next one after you. And that's how a valley learns to survive anything. One stubborn believer at a time. If a story about one woman's faith in an old man's memory, 600 hungry chickens, and a valley that learned to stop laughing meant something to you, stay close, because there are more stories like hers waiting to be told. Stories about the quiet, unglamorous kind of courage that doesn't announce itself with speeches, but simply shows up every morning and does the work anyway. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe if you want more stories from the frontier, where the real heroes were rarely the ones anybody expected. And leave a comment telling me which part of Adeline's story stayed with you longest. Because I read every one, and your stories are what keep this channel alive.